The abandoned ward sat like a forgotten relic of a time long past, its decaying walls echoing with the silence of years. The air, thick with dust and the faint, unsettling scent of mildew, hung heavy in the dim light that struggled to penetrate through the cracked windows. A team of investigators, all seasoned professionals with years of experience, walked cautiously through the empty hallways, their footsteps muffled by the worn-out linoleum floors. The echoes of their movements seemed to reverberate strangely, amplifying the sense that something was very wrong. It had been decades since the hospital was last in operation, yet its eerie presence lingered in the shadows. Abandoned after a fire had consumed most of the records, the ward had remained untouched, until now. The investigators had been given access to the building to search for any remaining clues that could shed light on the mysteries of its past. What they didn't expect was the feeling that they weren't alone. A faint scratching sound from behind one of the doors. A distant whisper that couldn't be explained. But there was no one there, at least no one they could see. As the team ventured deeper into the bowels of the hospital, their nerves began to fray. They had come here with one goal in mind, to uncover the truth behind the sudden and unexplained abandonment of the facility. The ward had been shut down without warning, its operations ceasing abruptly in the dead of night, leaving patients, staff, and records behind. No one had been able to provide a clear explanation for why or how it had happened. But it wasn't just the fire, the record destruction, or the unexplained shutdown that raised questions. There were whispers, rumors that had floated through the local community for years. Stories of strange experiments, of patients who had mysteriously vanished, never to be heard from again. Stories of staff who seemed to disappear into thin air, never offering any explanation for their sudden departures. The investigators knew that what they were about to uncover could be nothing short of explosive. But what they didn't know was that the truth would prove far darker than anyone could have imagined. One of the investigators, a former medical examiner named Sarah, was the first to feel it. As she walked down a narrow hallway, her eyes scanning the peeling paint and rusted medical equipment scattered on the floor, she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The distinct sound of a door creaking open echoed through the empty corridor, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Only the darkness. Her heart began to race, but she quickly shook off the feeling. She had seen plenty of strange things in her career. This wasn't the first time she had experienced something inexplicable in a place like this. But that didn't stop the unsettling feeling from growing. Her colleague, Mark, approached her with a flashlight, snapping her out of her reverie. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Yeah," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "Just thought I heard something." They continued walking, their footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. The others in the group, including Ben, a historian with an affinity for obscure medical histories, and Tom, a former investigator for the local police, were already a few steps ahead. They were all here for the same reason, to piece together the mystery of what had happened in this ward all those years ago. But none of them knew what they were walking into. As they rounded a corner, Sarah's flashlight illuminated something unusual. A door that had been sealed shut for decades. The wood was warped and covered in a thick layer of dust, but there was something about it that felt different from the others. The team stopped in their tracks. "That's odd," Ben muttered, stepping forward to examine the door. "This shouldn't be here. This area was supposed to be completely abandoned." Sarah stepped closer, her flashlight flickering as she shone it on the door. The air seemed to grow colder, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Without thinking, she reached out and turned the handle. It was locked, but there was an odd resistance as if something was behind the door, pressing against it. She pushed harder, and the door gave way, creaking open just enough to reveal a sliver of what lay beyond. A musty, damp smell flooded the corridor, and the team exchanged uneasy glances. It was the kind of smell that suggested something had been hidden away for far too long. The room beyond was pitch dark, the faintest outline of what looked like old medical equipment visible in the dim light. Mark stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "What is this place?" Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. Ben, ever the historian, immediately began examining the room, muttering under his breath about old hospital wards and records. This room wasn't on any of the original blueprints," he said. "It's like it was built after the hospital was established. And look at these files." He gestured toward a set of old folders, stacked neatly on a table in the center of the room. Sarah walked closer, her curiosity piqued. She reached for one of the files, feeling the weight of it in her hands. It was aged, the edges yellowed with time, and there were strange symbols scribbled in the margins. She opened the first page, her eyes scanning the words. Most of it was in code, phrases that didn't make sense, but the name Patient 19 was repeated several times throughout the pages. She paused, a chill running down her spine. Patient 19, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've never heard of this one. Mark leaned over her shoulder, peering at the documents. It could be just another record, Sarah. We've seen a lot of these. But there was something about these files that felt wrong, too specific, too detailed. The more she read, the more she felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest. The symbols, the cryptic notes. It all seemed like a puzzle, one that she couldn't quite put together. Suddenly, Ben's voice broke through her thoughts. Guys, he said, his voice tight with unease. You need to see this. The team moved quickly toward the back of the room, where Ben was standing over a small table covered with glass vials and syringes. Some of the vials were cracked, their contents long dried up, while others remained sealed. But it wasn't the vials that had caught Ben's attention. It was the small, faded photograph resting on the table. The image showed a woman young and gaunt, lying in a hospital bed. Her eyes were wide open, staring directly at the camera, and her expression was one of pure terror. Beneath the photo in a faint red ink were the words, Patient 19, never leave her alone. Sarah felt a strange pull toward the photo, but as her fingers brushed against it, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. She snapped her head around, her heart racing. But when she turned, there was no one there. Just the empty, hollow silence of the abandoned ward. The investigators' unease deepened. There was something in this place, something alive in the darkness. And they were about to find out just how much of the ward's past was still lurking in the shadows. The team gathered around the photograph, their unease palpable as the weight of their discovery began to sink in. Sarah couldn't shake the chilling feeling that the photo had been placed there for them to find, as if it was waiting. The woman in the picture, Patient 19, looked so real, so alive, but there was an unmistakable sense of dread in her eyes. It was the kind of look that suggested she knew something they didn't, something dark and dangerous that had been hidden from the world for years. Ben, ever the historian, continued to inspect the surroundings. The vials and syringes had clearly been used, but for what? They didn't look like anything you'd find in a standard medical facility. There were no labels, no explanations, just an eerie quiet. He picked up one of the syringes, examining it closely, but there was nothing significant about it, just an odd, unsettling feeling about the room itself. Could these be part of the experiments? Mark asked, breaking the silence. He was crouched down, inspecting the files that had been scattered on the table. We've seen files with these same symbols. This might be where they conducted the tests. This room wasn't on any records. It wasn't even supposed to exist. Sarah glanced at the files again, her mind racing. The symbols were unlike anything she had ever seen in her years of medical practice. They didn't match any known codes or medical notations she had come across. Some were intricate, almost ritualistic in nature, while others seemed more like random scribbles, as if the person writing them had been rushing to document something before it was too late. She tried to focus, attempting to make sense of the contents, but the words blurred together as the overwhelming sense of dread continued to grow. As she flipped through more of the papers, she came across something that made her pause, a patient ledger. This wasn't a typical patient record, though. It was filled with cryptic entries, some incomprehensible, others fragmented. The list of names went on for pages, each entry preceded by a number. Patient 1, Patient 2, Patient 3. The names were all ordinary enough at first glance, but there were anomalies. The names of people who had disappeared, people who had never been heard from again. But what stood out the most was the entry for Patient 19. The name was circled multiple times, and next to it was a peculiar note, "Do not let her wake." The word struck Sarah like a bolt of lightning. What kind of hospital, what kind of place, would have a note like that in its records? The implications were chilling. Who was Patient 19? Why was she so important, and what had happened to her? Was she part of the experiments? Had she somehow escaped the madness? As Sarah was lost in thought, Ben spoke up again, his voice filled with a mixture of shock and curiosity. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of old blueprints that had been hidden behind the files. The blueprints were marked with dates, some from the 1950s, others from the 1970s, and they showed the layout of the ward as it had once been, but with subtle differences. There were additional rooms, hidden passageways, and areas that didn't exist on the original floor plans. Ben looked at Sarah, his face pale. This wasn't just a hospital. This was a laboratory. A place of experimentation. Sarah felt her stomach churn. The thought that this place had been more than just a medical facility, it had been a place where human beings were experimented on, tortured, or worse, was almost too much to bear. But it made sense, didn't it? The strange symbols, the odd medical instruments, the locked rooms. It was all starting to fit together in a way that she couldn't quite fully understand, but she knew they had stumbled upon something monumental, something dangerous. Mark, who had been pacing nervously, suddenly stopped and pointed to a section of the blueprint that made Sarah's blood run cold. "There's a room here, look at this. It's not even on the current floor plan of the hospital. But on these older blueprints, it's marked clearly. And look at the description. It says, containment chamber." "Containment chamber?" Tom echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" Ben squinted at the blueprint. "It's hard to say, but judging by the other notes, this seems to have been a place where patients were kept. Isolated. Controlled. This is where they did the experiments. But we have no idea what they were testing, what they were trying to do." Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She had read about places like this in history, dark, forgotten institutions where human life was treated as expendable, where the line between science and madness had long been erased. But she never thought she would find herself standing in one. It was one thing to study these places from a distance, to read about them in textbooks or hear about them in whispered rumors. It was another thing entirely to be standing in the midst of it all, uncovering pieces of a puzzle that, if completed, might tear apart everything they thought they knew about this place. They had to know more. They had to uncover the truth. The team gathered around, each one of them feeling the weight of the discovery. They had unearthed a hidden room, old records, and blueprints that hinted at a much darker reality than they had ever anticipated. But what were the experiments? What had been done to the patients? And most importantly, where had patient 19 gone? Suddenly, Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The air grew heavier, as though the very building itself was holding its breath. A strange, faint humming sound began to echo through the corridor. At first they thought it was just the old pipes creaking, but then the noise grew louder, more distinct, like the sound of something moving, something unnatural. "Did you hear that?" Mark asked, his voice tight with fear. "Yeah," Ben replied, looking around nervously. "What is that?" The humming sound grew louder, more pronounced, until it seemed to be coming from behind a wall, one of the walls they hadn't yet investigated. It was a rhythmic sound, like a machine running, and it filled the entire room. The team exchanged uneasy glances. There was no machine here. There was no electricity running in the building. Everything had been cut off years ago. But the sound was still there. Without a word, they moved toward the source of the noise, each step feeling heavier than the last. They approached a section of the wall where the sound seemed to be coming from. Mark reached forward, his hand trembling slightly, and ran his fingers along the surface of the wall. It was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so. He pressed harder, and with a faint creak, a section of the wall gave way. Behind it, a small hidden room revealed itself, a room that hadn't been listed on any of the blueprints. The air inside the room was thick and oppressive. The humming sound was almost deafening now, and the team stepped inside cautiously, their hearts pounding in their chests. What they saw inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the center of the room, in the dim light of their flashlights, stood a machine. It was unlike anything any of them had ever seen before. Large, metallic, and covered in wires and tubes, it hummed with life, its purpose unclear. And sitting in a chair next to the machine, eyes wide open, was a figure, a person who looked like they had been asleep for years. A person who looked an awful lot like patient 19. The discovery of the hidden room, the machine, and the figure sitting motionless in the chair left the investigators stunned. The air in the chamber was thick, heavy with an electric charge that hummed in the silence. Their flashlights flickered, casting long shadows across the room as the investigators slowly approached. Sarah, the medical examiner, was the first to step forward. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her eyes were fixed on the person in the chair. It was impossible to determine the person's age. Too many years had passed, and their features were obscured by the dim light. But there was something about the way they sat, so still, almost lifeless, that sent a chill crawling up Sarah's spine. The figure's hair was matted and unkempt, their skin pale and their clothes tattered. It was a haunting sight, like someone who had been trapped in time. "Is this patient 19? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben leaned in, squinting as he examined the figure more closely. "It has to be," he replied. "It matches the description from the records we found, the same person from the photograph. But why is she here and why is she still alive?" The humming sound from the machine grew louder, a constant rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate deep in their bones. The machine in the corner of the room was a monstrosity, a tangled mass of wires, metal, and strange apparatuses, most of which they couldn't identify. It seemed out of place in the context of a hospital ward, more like something out of a twisted science fiction movie. It wasn't just an old medical device, it was something far more sinister. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, kneeling down beside the chair. She reached out a hand, placing it gently on the figure's shoulder. The person in the chair flinched slightly, their eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The woman's eyes were wide and unblinking, filled with a hollow emptiness that sent a shiver through Sarah's spine. There was no recognition in her gaze, just a deep, unfathomable fear. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply stared at Sarah, her eyes locked onto the investigators with an intensity that was unsettling. "Hello," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling despite herself. "Can you hear me? Are you okay?" The woman's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but only a soft, raspy breath escaped. Her lips moved, but no words followed. It was as if her body was too weak or perhaps too damaged to respond. Sarah's heart ached for her. There was something tragic about the woman's existence, as though she had been forgotten by time, left to linger in this forsaken place for years. Mark, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward cautiously. Is she even alive?" he asked. His voice was thick with doubt. "She's alive," Sarah replied, her voice steadying as she examined the woman's faint breath. "But just barely. Whatever happened to her, it's left her in a state of suspension. She's not fully conscious, but she's not fully gone either." Ben was already scanning the machine, his mind racing to understand its function. "This machine," he murmured. "It looks like some kind of life support device, but it's not meant for healing. It's more like a containment chamber, a way to keep someone alive without actually letting them live." "Containment," Tom repeated, stepping closer. "But why would they need to keep her alive like this? What was the purpose of all this?" The answer seemed to hover in the air, unspoken but understood by each of them. Whatever experiments had taken place in this ward, whatever horrors had been carried out in the name of medical science, patient 19 had been central to it. She wasn't just a victim, she was the subject of something far darker than any of them could have imagined. Sarah turned back to the woman in the chair. "Do you remember anything?" she asked gently, her voice almost pleading. "Can you tell us what happened here? What they did to you?" The woman's lips trembled as if she were trying to speak, but no words came. Instead, her hand twitched and she raised it slowly, pointing toward the machine with a shaking finger. It was as though she was trying to communicate, to convey something through her silence. "Look at that," Ben said, his voice sharp with realization. "The machine, it's connected to her. There's something in it, something that's keeping her alive. But how? Why her? What's going on?" The air in the room felt colder now, as if the walls were closing in around them. Tom, his face pale with fear, took a step back. "We need to get her out of here. We need to get her help." "We can't," Sarah said softly. "Not yet. We have to understand what happened first. We have to know what they were doing to her. If we pull her out now, we might be pulling her out of the only thing keeping her alive." The team stood in a tense silence, each of them grappling with the gravity of what they had discovered. It was one thing to uncover a dark, twisted history of experiments and disappearances. It was another thing entirely to come face to face with the living proof of that history, a woman who had endured something unspeakable, trapped in a state of limbo. "Let's go through the records again," Ben suggested, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotions swirling around him. "Maybe we missed something. Maybe there's a clue, something that tells us what this machine is really doing and how we can help her." Sarah nodded, reluctantly standing and moving back toward the desk where the files had been scattered. She couldn't shake the image of patient 19's vacant stare from her mind. The woman had been kept here for years, maybe even decades, subjected to something that had turned her into a shadow of her former self. What kind of monster would do this to another human being? What kind of twisted mind would choose to prolong someone's suffering for the sake of experimentation? As she rifled through the files, she came across more references to patient 19, but nothing that gave her a clear answer. There were dates, codes, and symbols she couldn't decipher, but nothing that explained the machine or the woman's role in whatever experiments had been carried out here. One particular file, however, caught her attention. It was a journal entry, written by someone whose handwriting was shaky and uneven. The entry read, "The machine is not working as expected. Patient 19's condition is deteriorating faster than anticipated. We may have pushed her too far. The results of the experiment are inconclusive. But I cannot stop. I cannot let it fail. She is the key." The last sentence sent a shock through Sarah's system. She is the key. What did that mean? How was patient 19 the key to this twisted experiment? And what kind of key could possibly justify the agony she had been subjected to? Sarah's hands trembled as she set the journal down. She couldn't stop thinking about the phrase, "she is the key." It haunted her, turning over and over in her mind like a bad memory she couldn't escape. Whatever they had done to patient 19, it had been part of something much larger than they had first realized. And the truth, whatever it was somewhere in this room waiting to be uncovered. But as the team exchanged worried glances, a single horrifying thought crossed their minds. They weren't the only ones looking for the truth. The room seemed to close in around them, the cold air pressing against their skin as the unsettling hum of the machine continued to pulse, rhythmic and steady. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts swirling as she processed the journal entry. She is the key. The words echoed in her head, each repetition weighing heavier than the last. What kind of experiment had been conducted here, and why had patient 19 been chosen to be at its center? She couldn't shake the image of the woman in the chair, her hollow, vacant eyes staring into nothingness. It was clear that whatever had been done to her, it had left deep scars, physical, psychological, maybe even something more profound. Sarah knew that there was only one way to find out the full truth. They had to keep digging, no matter how dark or dangerous the path might become. But in the pit of her stomach, she felt the growing awareness that the more they uncovered, the more they might wish they hadn't. Ben, who had been silently observing the machine, spoke up, his voice strained. "We need to disable it. Whatever it is, whatever it's doing to her, it's not natural. It's keeping her in a state between life and death. This machine isn't medical. It's something else." Sarah nodded slowly, but her gaze remained fixed on patient 19, her expression full of sorrow and uncertainty. "I agree. But how do we even begin? We don't know how this thing works, and we don't know what it might do if we try to turn it off." Tom, who had been pacing near the door, seemed to finally come to a decision. "We don't have a choice. If she's been kept like this for so long, whatever's keeping her alive is probably doing more harm than good. We need to figure out how to stop this, or we risk losing her forever." There was a long, tense pause. The sound of the machine's hum filled the room like an ominous warning. The atmosphere was thick with uncertainty, but in the end each of them knew that they had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Mark approached the machine, his steps slow and deliberate. He traced his fingers over its cold surface, feeling the vibration of its internal workings. The machine seemed to thrum with a life of its own, and he couldn't help but wonder how long it had been running, how long it had been keeping patient 19 trapped in a state of limbo. He bent down, examining the tangled wires and tubes that connected to her, trying to make sense of the complex system. "This isn't just a machine," Mark muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "This is some kind of containment device. The way the wires are connected, it's like she's being sustained by it. But it's more than just keeping her alive. It's like it's controlling her." Sarah stepped closer, her brow furrowing as she observed the intricate web of tubes and wires. Controlling her? How could something like this control a person? "It's not possible." "It's possible if the person isn't fully conscious," Ben interjected, his voice grim. "If they're in some kind of suspended state where their mind is barely functioning, then yes, it's possible. This machine is probably designed to keep her in that state, preventing her from fully waking up or fully passing away. It's like she's in some kind of coma, but even deeper than that." The more they examined the machine, the more it became clear that they were dealing with something far beyond ordinary medical technology. It wasn't just a life support system. It was a mechanism designed to suppress, to control, and to manipulate. Patient 19 wasn't just a victim of a tragic accident or a failed experiment. She was the focal point of something far more sinister, something that had been kept hidden for years. But what was it? What had they been trying to achieve? And why had they chosen her? Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden sound from the hallway, a faint shuffle of footsteps, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a chill down her spine. The others heard it too, and in an instant the room was filled with tension. The group exchanged uneasy glances, each one wondering the same thing. Who else was in this building? The air felt heavier now, thicker with the weight of unspoken suspicion. They had come to uncover the truth, but had they walked into something they couldn't handle? They were not alone, that much was clear. But who was out there and what did they want? Ben's voice broke the silence. "We need to get out of here. Whoever's out there, they could be a threat. They could be watching us right now." Tom, his eyes scanning the room nervously, nodded. "We've been poking around in places we shouldn't be. They might be trying to protect something or someone. It's clear this wasn't just some random abandoned hospital. Whoever ran this place had power, real power. And they'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets. Mark's eyes flicked to the door, his body tense. We have to move now. We can't let them find us here. Not while we're this close to the truth. With no time to lose, the team began to prepare for what could be a dangerous escape. They had come to uncover the hidden horrors of the abandoned ward, but now they were beginning to realize that the true danger wasn't the building itself, it was the people who had once controlled it. They weren't just up against the remnants of the past. They were up against forces that still wanted to keep those secrets buried. As Sarah took one last look at patient 19, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been done to her, she couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. Time was running out. Whatever had happened to this woman, it had been designed to be hidden. Whoever had orchestrated this had gone to great lengths to ensure that no one would ever discover what had really happened here. But now they had found the truth. And that truth was far darker than anything any of them could have imagined. They turned to leave the room, their footsteps quickening as the sound of shuffling footsteps in the hallway grew louder, closer. Someone was coming. They had to move, and they had to move fast. But as they reached the door, a voice, low and rasping, stopped them in their tracks. Don't go. It was patient 19. Her voice was weak, barely audible, but it was enough to make them freeze in their tracks. Sarah turned slowly, her heart aching as she saw the woman's eyes flicker open once more. What did you say? She asked, her voice trembling. Don't go, they'll find you. It's too late, you have to leave. The words were fragmented, almost impossible to understand, but the meaning was clear. They were in danger. And whatever secrets had been kept in this forsaken ward, they weren't meant to be uncovered. Not now. Not ever. The investigators stood frozen, torn between the overwhelming need to escape and the desperate need to find out more, to understand exactly what had happened here, what had been done to patient 19, and why it had been kept hidden for so long. But the truth, they now realized, was far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. And the more they uncovered, the more it became clear that they weren't the only ones who wanted the answers. Someone, or something, was willing to do whatever it took to keep those answers buried. The door behind them creaked open, and the investigators spun around, their hearts racing. But before they could react, a shadow moved swiftly through the doorway and everything went dark. The darkness in the room was sudden, overwhelming. The light from their flashlights flickered violently before cutting out entirely, leaving them in complete, suffocating blackness. For a moment, there was only silence, deep, unnerving silence, before the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall, slow and deliberate. Sarah's heart raced in her chest as she fumbled for her flashlight, her hands trembling with the sudden surge of fear. Mark was already by her side, his own flashlight clutched tightly, casting frantic beams of light into the shadows. But it was no use. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, and the footsteps grew louder, closer, like the ticking of an ominous clock counting down to something they couldn't yet understand. Who's there? Tom's voice broke through the tense quiet, strained with fear. He was close behind them, his body stiff with the sudden realization that they were not alone in this place. The footsteps halted, and for a moment, it felt as though the world had gone still. There was a tension in the air, an electricity that made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. She turned to look at the others, their faces pale in the faint light, the fear mirrored in their eyes. It wasn't just the isolation of the ward that was haunting. It was the deep, palpable sense that they were being watched, hunted by someone, or something, that didn't want them to uncover the truth. A voice broke the silence, cold and emotionless, though tinged with something far darker. You shouldn't have come here. It was a voice that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It wasn't loud, but it was clear and menacing, as though the person speaking had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The words hung in the air like a threat, heavy and loaded with meaning. The investigators stood frozen, not knowing who or what they were dealing with, but instinctively, they all knew that whoever or whatever had spoken, it was not a good sign. Who are you? Ben demanded, his voice steady but laced with urgency. What do you want from us? The voice chuckled, the sound low and hollow, almost as though it came from somewhere deep within the walls. I want nothing from you, it replied. But you've already taken everything from me. The words sent a shiver down Sarah's spine, and she could feel the cold sweat beading on her forehead. It was clear now that they had stumbled into something far beyond the realm of ordinary investigation. This wasn't just about uncovering a long-forgotten mystery. It was about disturbing something, someone, that had been hiding in the shadows, protecting its secrets at all costs. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, but it wasn't the soft, comforting glow they had relied on earlier. The room was now bathed in a harsh, sickly yellow light that cast long, grotesque shadows along the walls. The figure in the doorway was just as Sarah had feared, dark and menacing, a silhouette standing perfectly still in the threshold. There was something unsettling about their posture, something wrong about the way they stood, as if they were part of the darkness itself. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. But their presence was enough to paralyze the investigators with fear. Tom was the first to break the silence. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, stepping forward despite the fear gnawing at him. His voice trembled, but there was a force to it, an unwillingness to let whatever this was intimidate them. The figure didn't respond at first, but there was a soft sound, the faintest rustling, before a low voice spoke again, this time directly addressing Tom. "I am the one who has kept this place hidden. The one who ensured that the truth would never see the light of day." The words hit like a punch. Sarah felt a cold shiver race through her as she processed the statement. Whoever this person was, they weren't just some lost remnant of the past. They were actively protecting the secrets of the hospital. The experiments, the suffering, the entire twisted history, they were all part of something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The figure took a step forward, the harsh light now fully illuminating their features. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with sharp, angular features. His face was pale, almost ghostly, with dark circles under his eyes, as though he hadn't seen daylight in years. His expression was cold, almost unreadable, but there was a certain darkness in his gaze, something that suggested he knew exactly what had been done here and what was still at stake. "I am the last of them," the man said, his voice growing colder with each word. "The last one who knows the truth. You think you've uncovered everything, but you've only scratched the surface. You think you know what happened to this place, to the people here, but you have no idea what you're dealing with." The investigators exchanged wary glances. Sarah took a step forward, determined to confront him. "What did they do to her?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "What happened to patient 19? Why was she kept alive like this?" The man's lips curled into a faint smile, more of a sneer really, as he regarded her. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said softly, almost pityingly. "Patient 19 is not a victim. She's the catalyst. She's the one who made all of this possible." Ben took a step back, his face pale. "What are you talking about? What do you mean she's the catalyst?" The man's gaze grew sharper, and he tilted his head as if considering how best to explain. "She was the first one," he said, his voice slow, measured. "The first successful experiment. The first person to survive the procedure." Sarah felt a jolt of realization hit her. "Survive the procedure?" she repeated, her mind racing. "What procedure?" The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it, only a cold, almost sadistic glint in his eyes. "The procedure that gave us power," he replied, his voice almost reverent. "The procedure that allowed us to control life and death. To create something beyond human comprehension. Patient 19 wasn't just a test subject. She was the prototype. The key to everything we built here." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the gravity of his statement began to sink in. Whatever had happened here, whatever experiments had taken place, it was far worse than anything she could have imagined. The hospital hadn't just been a place for medical care or even twisted experiments. It had been a breeding ground for something else, something monstrous, something that defied the very laws of nature. "And the others?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The missing patients? Were they part of this too?" The man's expression hardened. "The others were failures," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "They didn't survive the procedure. But patient 19, she was the breakthrough. She was the one who proved that it could work. That we could control life, control death. That we could create something immortal." Sarah felt a wave of nausea hit her. The implications of his words were too much to bear. They had been dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple medical mystery. They had been uncovering a twisted experiment to transcend mortality itself, one that had cost countless lives. "But why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why do this? What's the point of controlling life and death?" The man's gaze turned cold, his eyes narrowing as though she had asked a foolish question. "Power," he said simply. "The ultimate power. The ability to control not just life, but the very essence of what it means to exist. To play God." He took a step closer, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. "You should have never come here. The truth is too dangerous. Now you're involved in something that can never be undone." The room seemed to grow colder still as the team processed the man's words. They had uncovered something far darker than they had ever anticipated. And now they realized they were no longer just investigators, they were part of a much bigger, far more dangerous game. As the figure moved to block the door, his silhouette a dark, looming presence, Sarah felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. They had come for answers, but they hadn't just found the truth, they had stumbled into something far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. And now they had to face the consequences. The figure in the doorway remained motionless, blocking their only exit. The investigators stood frozen, the weight of his words sinking in like a leaden anchor. The room felt smaller now, the air thick and oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to process everything the man had just revealed. This wasn't just an abandoned hospital. This wasn't just a simple case of long-forgotten medical history. What they had uncovered went far beyond that. It was an entire hidden world of twisted experimentation, a dark pursuit of immortality that had been hidden away for decades. But there was more. The man standing before them, his eyes cold and full of malice, was not just some deranged doctor or mad scientist. He was something worse, someone who had played a central role in the creation of this nightmare. He had been part of something that no one had ever been meant to find. The weight of his presence alone seemed to suffocate the room, as if the building itself was alive, breathing, reacting to the danger they had stirred by uncovering its secrets. "You've made a mistake," the man said softly, his voice eerily calm. "Coming here was a mistake. You should have never opened those doors. Now you'll never leave." Tom took a step forward, his fists clenched, though his face was pale with fear. "What do you want from us?" he demanded, his voice shaking but resolute. "You can't keep us here. You can't just trap us." The man's lips twisted into a cruel smile, though his eyes remained cold, calculating. "Trap you?" he repeated as if amused by the idea. "You're already trapped. You just don't know it yet." Ben stepped forward, his voice trembling but determined. "What happened to patient 19? What did you do to her? Why did you keep her alive for all these years?" The man's smile faltered for a moment, a flicker of something, perhaps regret, perhaps something darker, flashing across his face. "Patient 19 was necessary," he said, his tone far colder now. "She was the catalyst. Without her, none of this would have been possible. She was the first successful attempt at immortality." The room seemed to tighten around Sarah as she absorbed the magnitude of his words. Immortality. They had been playing with forces they couldn't possibly understand. And now they were in the middle of it, caught up in something far too dangerous to stop. "But why her?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "Why did you choose her? What made her so special?" The man's expression darkened as he regarded her, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might not answer. But then he spoke, his voice low and filled with a strange mixture of pride and bitterness. "Patient 19 was chosen because she had the right qualities, the right genetic makeup. She was perfect for the procedure. The others didn't survive, but she did. She was the first, the one who proved that it was possible, that we could defy nature itself." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. The others, there had been others. She had suspected it, but hearing it spoken out loud made it real. People had been used as experiments, subjects in a twisted quest to play God, to conquer death itself. And patient 19 had been the key. The one who had survived, the one who had made all of this possible. "But how?" Ben demanded, his voice rough with frustration. "How did you do it? How did you make her immortal?" The man's lips curled into a sneer as if the question was beneath him. The procedure was simple. It wasn't about keeping someone alive in the traditional sense. It was about altering the body at its core, rewriting its very biology. "We used a combination of advanced medical techniques, genetic manipulation, and—" He paused for a moment, almost savoring the next words. "Energy." "Energy?" Sarah repeated, her mind racing. "What kind of energy? What does that even mean?" The man's eyes gleamed as he spoke, his words slow and deliberate, as if he was explaining something to a child. "Energy is life. It's the force that keeps all things alive, that makes everything move. We tapped into that. We found a way to manipulate it, to channel it into the human body. The energy was the key to keeping the body alive, to preventing decay. And patient 19, she was the first to withstand it, the first to survive the process long enough to be perfected." The air in the room grew heavy as the investigators tried to process what they were hearing. This was beyond anything they had ever imagined. They had come to uncover a mystery, to find out what had happened to a hospital long abandoned. But now they were learning that what had taken place here was no ordinary medical experiment. It was an abomination, a violation of everything that should have been sacred. The boundaries of life and death had been blurred, twisted beyond recognition. And patient 19 was at the center of it all. "Where is she?" Mark asked suddenly, his voice desperate. "Where is patient 19 now? Is she still alive? Can we help her?" The man's expression hardened, his gaze icy. "She is beyond your help," he said coldly. "She's beyond anyone's help. What she became, it wasn't meant to be. The procedure went too far. But now she is bound to the machine. Bound to the energy that keeps her from decaying. She can never be freed." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the full extent of what had been done to patient 19. She wasn't just a victim of experimentation, she was trapped in an unnatural state of existence, caught between life and death, her body and mind held hostage by the very energy that had been used to save her. There was no escape for her. There was no escape for any of them, not if they remained here. "And what about you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "What happened to you? How are you still alive after all these years?" The man's gaze darkened, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of something almost human behind his cold eyes, something that looked like regret or maybe even fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I am the last one," he said flatly. "The last of the doctors, the last of the ones who worked on this project. The rest of them, they couldn't handle the power we unleashed. They became unstable. But I stayed. I continued the work. I perfected it." Perfected. The word hung in the air, twisted and hollow. This man had not just been a participant in a failed experiment. He had continued it, fed it, nurtured it, turning it into something even darker. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and now he was the only one left, holding on to the remnants of a legacy built on suffering and madness. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," he continued, his voice growing colder. "This place, this ward, it wasn't just a hospital. It was a sanctum. A place where immortality was crafted, where we shaped the future. But you've gone too far. You've uncovered something that was never meant to be found. And now you'll pay the price." As the words left his mouth, Sarah felt the temperature in the room drop. The air felt heavy, thick with the energy that had been manipulated and controlled for so long. She could almost feel it pressing against her skin, a hum beneath the surface of the walls. The machine in the corner seemed to pulse with a new intensity, as though it had come alive in response to the tension building in the room. Tom moved first, his instincts kicking in. He reached for his gun, his hands shaking, but the man didn't seem to react. Instead, his lips curled into another cold, mirthless smile. "You think that will stop me?" he said, his voice mocking. "You think you can leave here alive? You're already part of the experiment. You've been marked. And there's no turning back now." Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking them in. The light flickered again, and Sarah felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. The room seemed to pulse with energy, a strange force filling the space, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. They were trapped, not just physically, but by the truth they had uncovered, a truth that had ensnared them in ways they hadn't yet begun to understand. The man in front of them, the last survivor of the hospital's dark past, was the least of their problems now. They had awakened something far darker, and now they had to face it. The room felt like it was closing in on them, the walls pressing in tighter with every passing second. Sarah's heart was racing as the weight of their situation finally hit her with full force. There was no escape, not physically, not mentally. The door was locked, the figure in front of them had made it clear they were trapped, and worse yet, they were now involved in something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. They had come seeking answers, but the truth had brought them face to face with something dark and unimaginable. And now that truth had turned into a threat, a living, breathing nightmare they couldn't outrun. Tom's hand was still gripping the gun, though his knuckles were white with the effort. His eyes were wide, full of fear and disbelief. "This is crazy," he muttered, his voice cracking. "This can't be happening. We have to get out of here. We have to." The man in front of them didn't move, his presence almost oppressive as he stood still in the doorway, watching them with a detached amusement. There was no hurry in his posture, no sense of urgency. He was completely calm, completely in control, as though this had all been predestined. The man's cold eyes flicked briefly to the gun in Tom's hand, then back to the group. "You can try," he said with a soft, almost bored chuckle. "But it won't do you any good. You've already crossed the line. You've seen too much. And now you're mine." His words echoed in the small, cramped space, bouncing off the walls and amplifying the sense of hopelessness in the room. For the first time since they had arrived, Sarah felt truly afraid, not of the man in front of them but of what he represented. The true depth of the darkness they had uncovered, the horrific power that had been allowed to fester in this forgotten place, was now fully revealed. And they were caught in its grip, unable to escape. Ben's voice broke through the thick silence. "What is it you want from us?" His words were sharp, but his eyes were full of fear, his voice betraying him. "Why are you doing this?" The man tilted his head slightly, his expression one of amusement, as if Ben's question was laughable. "What I want doesn't matter. What you want is irrelevant. You're already part of something bigger than you can comprehend. It's too late to turn back now." Sarah felt the room grow colder still, an icy chill that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. It wasn't just the man in front of them that made her feel trapped. It was the knowledge that they were dealing with something that transcended logic, something that had already seeped into their lives, their bodies, their minds. They were caught in a web that had been spun long before they even knew this place existed. "How long has this been going on?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. She couldn't help herself. She had to understand the full scope of the nightmare they were trapped in. "How long have you been doing this?" The man's eyes darkened, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah could see something in his gaze, something like a flicker of the human being he once had been. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by a cold, impenetrable emptiness. "Longer than you could imagine," he replied. "We've been perfecting this process for decades. It wasn't just about creating immortality, it was about controlling it, manipulating the very fabric of life itself. You don't understand the power we wield here. You have no idea what you stumbled into." His words hung in the air like a warning, but also like a challenge. Sarah could feel the weight of them pressing down on her, like the air itself was getting thicker. The sense of foreboding in the room was suffocating. They had walked into something far darker than any of them could have imagined, and now they were locked in this room with no way out. "I'm not afraid of you," Tom said suddenly, his voice rough with anger. His grip on the gun tightened. "You're not going to stop us. We're getting out of here and you can't stop us." The man didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to care about the gun, the threat that it represented. Instead, his lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. "You think I'm the one you need to worry about?" he asked, his voice low and dark. "You think I'm the one holding you here?" Before anyone could respond, a deep, resonating hum filled the room. It wasn't just the sound of machinery, it was something deeper, something alive, as though the building itself was responding to the man's words. The air vibrated with a low frequency, and Sarah felt a cold, prickling sensation crawl down her spine. It was as if the walls were closing in on them from all sides, the room warping and twisting with a malevolent energy that seemed to emanate from the very floor beneath their feet. Suddenly, the machine in the corner of the room sparked to life. Its gears began to turn, its lights flickering in an eerie, unnatural rhythm. The hum of the machine intensified, and the air felt thick with static electricity. The man stepped back slightly, his expression unreadable as he watched the device come to life. "You've disturbed something you don't understand," he said softly. "This place is not just a hospital. It's a conduit, a bridge between worlds, between life and death. And now you've awakened it. You've awakened the true power of this place." Ben's eyes darted around the room, panic creeping into his voice. "What are you talking about? What is that thing?" The man's gaze flicked briefly to the machine, then back to them. "It's the heart of everything, the core of the procedure. Without it, none of this would be possible. Without it, patient 19 wouldn't have survived. The energy that powers it is the energy that keeps everything alive. Keeps her alive. Keeps me alive." Sarah felt a sinking feeling in her chest. She had suspected there was more to this machine than they had first realized, but hearing the man's words made it all the more real, all the more horrifying. Whatever it was, whatever it did, it wasn't just some strange medical experiment. It was something far more dangerous, something that defied the natural order of life and death. "You think you can just stop it?" the man asked, his voice taking on a cruel edge. "You think you can shut it down? You think you can erase everything we've built here with the flip of a switch?" Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she forced herself to speak. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "You've gone too far. We can stop this. We can stop you." The man laughed, a low, sinister sound that seemed to echo off the walls. "Stop me?" he repeated. "You're too late. You're already part of it. All of you. The moment you stepped into this room, the moment you uncovered the truth, you sealed your fate. This is your new reality. There's no escaping it." Mark's voice cracked with frustration and fear. "We're not part of anything. We're just here for the truth. We're here to stop this, to make sure it doesn't happen again. But the man's cold eyes regarded them with a sense of finality. You don't understand, he said softly. The truth is not what you think it is. You were never meant to know what happened here. You were never meant to know what we've done. Now you'll become a part of it. You'll become part of the legacy of immortality. The hum from the machine grew louder, more intense, as if responding to his words. The air seemed to throb with an unnatural energy, a pulse that vibrated through their very bones. It was as if the building itself was alive, feeding off their fear, their confusion. And as the machine roared to life, Sarah felt the cold grip of panic wrap around her heart. They had uncovered something that should have stayed buried. They had awoken something that was never meant to see the light of day. And now there was no turning back. The machine's hum filled the room like the heartbeat of some ancient, dark creature, its rhythm pulsing in the air around them. Sarah could feel the vibrations in her chest, the sound growing louder and more erratic as if the room itself was coming to life. The dim, flickering lights cast long shadows that seemed to twist and stretch like monstrous figures in the corners of the room. It was as though the walls, the floor, even the very air itself, were all complicit in the darkness that had been uncovered. She tried to steady her breath, to push the mounting panic down, but it was difficult. The man standing before them seemed impervious to the chaos, his gaze unwavering as he watched the machine hum and churn with increasing intensity. His eyes were cold, his expression almost serene, as though he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. We were never meant to understand this, Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible over the noise. This is bigger than all of us. The man didn't respond at first, but his lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. He took a step closer, his footsteps barely audible on the floor as if he were floating. You're right, he said softly. You were never meant to understand. But you've seen too much. And now you'll be part of it. His words hit Sarah like a wave crashing over her, drowning her in the reality of their situation. They were trapped, caught in the web of something so far beyond their control, so far beyond their comprehension, that it felt as though the very laws of nature were being bent and twisted around them. And worse yet, the more they uncovered, the more they realized they had been walking straight into the heart of it all, the very core of a nightmare that had been waiting for them. Tom stepped forward, his gun still clutched tightly in his hands, but his resolve was visibly cracking. What do you want from us? He demanded, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. We're not part of your experiment. We're just trying to stop this. We just want to get out of here. The man's gaze flicked briefly to the gun, then back to Tom, his smile widening as though he found the entire situation amusing. You think the gun will save you? You think you can stop what's coming? His voice grew colder, more detached. It's too late for that. You can't stop what's already been set in motion. The moment you uncovered the truth, you sealed your fate. Now you're just another piece of the puzzle. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. There was no escape. There never had been. The man was right. They had crossed a line and now there was no going back. The door was locked. The machine was alive. They were part of the experiment now, whether they liked it or not. The machine's hum grew louder still, almost deafening, and the walls seemed to shake with the sheer force of its power. The lights flickered, casting eerie, ghostly shadows that danced across the floor. For a brief moment, Sarah thought she saw movement in the corner of the room, a figure just out of the corner of her eye. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Just the cold, sterile emptiness of the abandoned ward. What is that thing? Mark asked, his voice strained with panic. He had been quiet up until now, but the increasing intensity of the machine had finally broken through his silence. His eyes darted to the machine, then back to the man. What's it doing? What's it supposed to do?